So now we move on to marriage. We are first going to talk about what keeps relationships strong, because we've already talked about how people get in relationships for a large part. And then we're going to talk about some negatives, including widowhood and remarriage. So I'm just going to give you some examples. This is by no means an exhaustive list of what keeps relationships strong, but instead just some articles that I've read that I think give kind of interesting different perspectives than your book might. So the first thing to talk about here is gratitude. In general, people who feel more appreciated by their partners report also being more appreciative, meaning if they feel like their partner is appreciating them, then they appreciate their partner. And in turn, they are more responsive to their partner's needs and are more committed and likely to stay in the relationship over time. So I feel that my wife appreciates the work I do, so then I appreciate the work she does, and therefore you're more likely to pick up the slack to help cleaning or whatever, and that kind of binds you together a little bit. And this is, in part, how it goes. So you feel appreciated, therefore you are appreciative, and that leads to you doing more maintenance of the relationship, such as discussing difficult topics, working through something that you don't necessarily want to do. It could even be something, like I already said, like doing the dishes or something like that. Therefore, you do that, the other person feels appreciated, more appreciative, and on and on. And it's kind of this cyclical thing. It's a good thing. And prior research has also shown that people who believe they are in a relationship with a good partner are more optimistic about the future of the relationship. And that makes a lot of sense. This is one of the cases where we probably don't even need psychology to tell us this, right? If you think you are in a current good relationship, you say in the future it's more likely to be good. So if you see that your partner is doing something good, helpful, you are probably more likely to say, yeah, I can be with this person for a while. And let's hit on this relationship maintenance a little bit more. So, as I said before, trying to solve conflicts with partners, sacrifice, offering to do things that aren't required, anything like that. And this is actually in marriages one of the biggest ways that people can feel appreciated. So if you do something for someone else, that is actually in a marriage, especially when you have kids, that's a pretty big deal. When you are individual people, if you are living in different places, then it oftentimes is assumed that at your house you will do the dishes or clean up if you have a date come over to your place, and vice versa. However, when you're together, there's this stuff that needs to get done. The romantic part of, cooking a dinner and cleaning up is not there as much. Now you've got to just do it, especially with kids. There's a lot more dishes that they can't do, especially when they are young. So you do things like this that are actually a pretty big part of showing that you care about someone in these ways. And it also is evolutionary in terms of something called signaling theory. And that is that we are predisposed to detect people who are cooperative. And we then think we should get in long-term relationships with these people. If someone is cooperative, it makes sense to stay around them, even at the level of friends. If you have friends who do nice things for you, it makes sense to stay around with them because they are going to be kind and helpful, etc., etc., etc. So this relationship maintenance is good for the relationship, and it has its links in many different areas, but one that pops up is evolutionary theory. So first one, gratitude. Next one, emotional capital. Emotional capital can help answer why some relationships survive adversity and threats and others don't. And the idea behind emotional capital is that relationships have an emotional bank account, quote unquote, and that bank account is filled with positive shared experiences. The definition of emotional capital is actually just positive emotional investment into one's relationship. So you do something good with your partner, that is kind of a deposit into the bank account. Now, we need to be clear here that it doesn't just mean that it's not another term for saying that someone is emotionally invested, because that can include things like overdependency, jealousy, anger, things like that. Emotional capital is positive. So when you have this emotional bank account with experiences deposited in it, then disagreements, conflicts, or negative partner behavior, those should be more damaging to people who don't have positive shared experiences. Essentially, if you think of two relationships, both of them have a lot of conflict, but one of them also has a lot of good things. Which one of those two relationships is more likely to last? Of course, it's the one that has more positive shared experiences. Additionally, people with higher emotional capital are actually less reactive to relationship threats, meaning things that could possibly stop the relationship from being as positive. So, even as basic as your partner is talking to somebody of your sex and or gender, you might say, if you don't have that many positive shared experiences, maybe they're looking for someone else, and it could be kind of damaging to you. But if you don't, if you look at it and you just say, well, they are talking to someone, but I know we're good, then you're less reactive to that. Third, secure attachment in childhood. This one's fairly straightforward. Those who were securely attached in childhood tend to have more positive relationships later in life. Positive support is given. There's more emotional support, and it's better received by those with secure attachment. But you can look into that. We've talked about it a little bit before, so we're not going to stick with that too much. Type of love is next. There is some question about love types. You will hear many different ways of conceptualizing love. Love languages is one fairly common one, although that's not, at least I haven't seen it be as scientifically valid. But nonetheless, there are these different different dimensions to relationships, and a common way of looking at relationships is companionate versus compassionate. So companionate is companion, and compassionate is compassion. There's also romantic love. That's where a couple examples of statements. I want my partner physically, emotionally, and mentally. For me, my partner is the perfect romantic partner. But romantic love tends not to have obsession. Obsessive love, another type, where people would say or endorse the statement, I sometimes find it difficult to concentrate on work because thoughts of my partner occupy my mind. And sometimes I feel I can't control my thoughts. They are obsessively on my partner. And this can border on mania and oftentimes jealous love. Now, one of the better theories is Sternberg's triangular theory. This says that there are actually three components to love. There's passion, intimacy, and commitment. And different combinations of these three types form different forms of love. So passionate love is intimacy and passion without commitment. So very intimate, very passionate, but lacks the commitment. That's passionate love. Infatuated love is passion without commitment or intimacy. Fatuous love, that's Fatuous, it's like being infatuated. That's passion and commitment, but not intimacy. Nonetheless, there are tons of different types of these. You can look them up, but each of them seem to have different relationships to how well people do over time in their relationships. So for short-term relationships, as an example, passionate and romantic love is good, but companionate love is less good. For long-term relationships, having all three of them is good. Having kind of a companionate aspect also is good. The only one that is that's just not really that great is mania. So basically obsession, but that kind of makes sense. And last up on here, at least, is equity. Relationships are successful when the good things we give to our partner are equal to the good things they give us. At least that's the idea behind basic equity theory. The relationships are good when what we give to our partner is equal to what we get from our partners. However, there's a different theory that goes beyond just basic equity theory that says that partners are comfortable in their relationships when the ratio between perceived contributions and perceived benefits is equal. So the benefits don't have to be equal for both sides, but the ratio has to be equal. So a person who gives a ton to the relationship, but also gets a ton out of it, might be happy with someone who's not giving as much, but also doesn't get as much. So 2 points of equity here. The first one is that you don't have to be equal. I already said this. You don't have to be equal in benefits or equal in contributions, but it's the ratio. And the second is that it's perceived benefits. So notice that in the little diagram I have on the screen here. Perceived benefits. Meaning that it's up to the person what they think a benefit is. If you are outside of a relationship, you might think that, what the hell is this person doing in there? They're not getting anything out of this. You might be wrong. An outsider might think it's not working, but it can work. Not always, but it can work. And if it's unequal in terms of the relationship, they will try to leave the relationship or restore equity. And an interesting part here is we are also uncomfortable not just when we are giving too much to a partner, but when we are receiving too much. You can actually feel bad if your partner is doing a lot for you. Some of you might have either been a partner or been the partner on the receiving or the giving end, where somebody is like lavishing them with gifts or things like that. Sometimes you can feel guilty. It's like, hold on there. So just an example, I have a friend, let's just say, who lives with his girlfriend. She is working for a financial company that makes a ton of money. She was making 6 figures out of college. He is living with her and doesn't have a job. He didn't graduate from college. He is basically stays home and plays video games and smokes weed all the time. This person is, from the outside, you'd say this person is contributing nothing to this relationship, whereas the other one is bringing in all of this kind of money. They're not even paying for their apartment in a large metropolitan area. The girl's parents are. They come from money. So this guy's got a pretty sweet ride. So from the outside, we might say this is not equal, but the girl in this relationship is also kind of crazy. And so a lot of people might say, well, she is benefiting, or she is contributing a lot to the relationship, but she's also benefiting a lot because he's the only person in the world who could put up with her. So perhaps that's how this works out. He might not be benefiting as much, or he's benefiting a lot, but he also might be contributing a lot, especially to her mental health. So that could be how it works out. Okay, and now while I said this is the last variable we're going to be talking about in terms of what keeps relationships strong, I also want to talk about, ooh, excuse me, I pressed the wrong button. I want to talk about some interventions. From 2005, interventions for keeping relationships strong, so not variables as much as government actions or outside actions. So from 2005 to 2015, federal and state governments actually spent more than $900 million on couple and relationship education programs. So 10 years, $900 million. It's almost $100 million a year that federal and state governments have spent. And these education programs are primarily focused on lower income families. Other countries, especially the UK and Australia, have done them as well, but not as extensively as we have. And a meta-analysis looking at 38 studies on these interventions found small effects in studies where there was a control group in things like relationship quality, communication skills, relationship aggression, but not actually for relationship stability or co-parenting. So the relationships were better, communication better, less relationship aggression, but the relationships didn't last that much longer. When looking at one group versus post studies, they actually found moderate effects for satisfaction, communication, and co-parenting, but not relationship stability and not aggression. So that sounds like a lot of stuff, and you're probably going to have a hard time keeping that straight. The bottom line is there's kind of conflicting studies depending on whether it's pre-post, control group studies, looking over time, what are the variables that are enhanced. So there are positive effects, they just seem to change. Also, an interesting part of this is that these effects are smaller for more well-off families. And this is also a kind of interesting little thing here. Why would it be that if you are more wealthy or wealthier family, you don't benefit as much from these? Well, in part, it's harder to benefit as much when the relationships are more stable. More well-off families tend to have more stable relationships on average. Of course, there are outliers. But nonetheless, it's an additional kind of variable to throw in here. Now, there are problems here that these effects are relatively small. Low-income people are actually less likely to go to classes. People have tried to fix this by helping with childcare and transportation, but it might just be chronic stress of being low income that makes implementing changes difficult to do. And also, the effects in here are larger for married than non-married couples. So it seems like if there's that added variable, it helps out. Some people actually say that money that we're spending here should be spent on services to help ameliorate the economic and social problems, because it seems like these economic problems are one of the things that are holding people back. So it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on cancer. If there's a really big problem that you are not addressing, and instead you're addressing a problem that comes because of that, that's not as effective necessarily. Okay, so let's talk about some negative things here. So in addition to the stresses of troubled marriages, there are a variety of other aspects that can be problematic. So if you have a troubled marriage, it can help have you have a harder time seeking support in other relationships. And a variety of other things like that. But let's first take a look at troubled marriages from before divorces occur. And you can see this pre-divorce period is the first time. And we're going to focus also on the effects it has on kids. So in the pre-divorce period, there's relationship conflict. This is difficult for parents to deal with, of course. Nobody wants to have a bad relationship. But one thing that we often don't think about is that because we don't have foresight, we can't automatically and 100% accurately say which relationships are going to fail. Some of the children involved in these situations can actually have ill effects even before divorces occur. So if a kid goes to school and is having behavior problems, and you learn, as a teacher learns that, oh, their parents are going through a divorce, this makes sense. Well, think about before then, before the divorce actually occurs, there's parental conflict that very often influences the child. So it might not be that a child has problems because of the divorce. It might be that children have problems with behavior because of marital conflict prior to the divorce that's hard for other people to see. And one study in particular found that problems acting out in the early teen years were actually that were seen after divorces were present in 3 and 4 year olds, so way before it. Having a troubled relationship actually can have these effects on kids way before a divorce. So once you have the divorce, what is happening? Well, we're going to focus more on kids here, but partners who look at divorce as a solution can actually be upset because problems with kids continue. If you look at divorce as, hey, this once we get divorced, things are going to be better. I don't have to put up with this person. That might be true in some ways, but it also can lead to more problems for your child, and those problems with your children can kind of amplify the stress you are under. And this is true for custody also. Custody can be a big problem, and that's why mediation is sometimes a good thing. But immediately following the divorce, it depends on kind of how you have what your outlook is. If you understand that this is going to be a long-term situation you have to deal with, your children are going to struggle through it, you try to prepare properly for it, that obviously can help with some of the issues. There are chronic problems that come up following divorces, especially in finances. And especially for people who are the only income earner in the family, or only have one income in the family, the other person can have a lot of issues. So if you are a stay-at-home mom and there is a divorce, you suddenly have to go out and get a job when you might not have been planning on doing that for a little while, haven't been working in a while, the market is not particularly wonderful right now. That can be difficult to do. Additionally, finding childcare for when you work, all of these things are tough. And when you seek employment and when a family breaks in half, oftentimes people will be forced to move to poor neighborhoods. And when this occurs, you can lose the social networks in the neighborhoods you were in prior. If you move far away from friends and family, it can be difficult to keep that up. Especially if your child is moving schools, let's say. If you move from the school district you are in, and because you can't afford it being single now, and you move to a different school district, they can be forced to change schools, which obviously can be basically traumatizing for children at times. For divorced men, and some of this is going to sound kind of sexist, but it's also borne out in the literature, and it's a little bit less so today, but it is still the case that men who are divorced tend to have difficulties with everyday life, like shopping and cooking, doing the laundry, all of those types of things. The issues for women tend to be less like that, but more in terms of childcare. Women who get divorced are less likely to eat dinner with their children. Bedtimes become more erratic. Children are more likely to be late in school. And especially for boys, there are significant problems that pop up from this. Now, the recovery period. Recovery starts generally in the second year. And the single most effective way to increase the well-being of people is to have continued contact with a positively involved, non-custodial father. That is women tend to get custody, and so we're kind of assuming in that situation that having continued positive contact with the non-custodial father. That's the most effective support in child rearing. Friends can help out as well, grandparents also. And interestingly, grandparents tend to take on the gender roles of the person who is gone. So even if the father is no longer there and the grandmother is around, the grandmother can take on kind of the disciplinarian father gender role if that is what is out of the picture. And in this recovery period, children can still have issues, in part because even if their behavior changes, at schools and other organizations, it's often the case that the perception is that their behavior hasn't changed. So if you, we know from previous work that one of the issues with children long term is children who are temperamentally difficult. Why is that? Well, you kind of get a notion of who the child is and you start reacting them in certain ways. And we don't like thinking this and admitting this, but this is true even in schools. If they are able to move to a new school where their reputation doesn't follow them, they can actually be treated better. You might say they shouldn't have to move schools. It's hard to change reputations, though. All right, and last up on here, good divorces. The idea of a good divorce is a little bit too simplistic. If you add in a harmony and disharmony dimension, that can help us understand things. So if you think of harmony and disharmony, and marriage and divorce, we have 4 categories. So a harmonious marriage, a harmonious divorce, disharmonious marriage, and disharmonious divorce. Obviously, the worst thing to have is a disharmonious divorce. That's the worst. And the best to have is a harmonious marriage. Where we get into questions is what is better? Is it better to have a disharmonious marriage or a harmonious divorce? Those two categories are kind of similar, at least more similar than the other 2 categories on there. So this is not to say it's the only category, but it is certainly a way of conceptualizing divorces that can help us understand the phenomena better. This is a graph from your book, and it shows marital satisfaction over the lifespan. You see that it is relatively high when you're child-free, then down you go when you have infants, when you have preschool children, and it kind of hangs out there through adolescence. And then when kids get out of the house, it starts to skyrocket. So if you just moved out of your house, you should, be thanked by your parents. Marital satisfaction is actually at its lowest point immediately following the birth of children. But so it kind of goes down, down, down right around children, but then it pops back up. Once you kind of get used to the sleep and everything, it's relatively okay having infants. And then when it gets into preschool, that's when it takes a more kind of long-term downward movement. However, these effects are all small, so this looks big based on the graph, but it really only goes from 46 up to 56. I mean, this is 10 points. So if we had, it all the way down, it would be a much more truncated. So it goes from 52 down to 47, then up to 57. It's not that huge of an effect, not as large as people would think. One of the things that helps people over time also is saying that their spouse is their best friend. And people who look at marriage as a long-term commitment. If you don't have an understanding kind of what you're buying yourself into, you're surprised by things that happen that are kind of straightforward, that's obviously difficult. Many people who get towards the later stages over here can view marriage, view their marital partner as more interesting, growing more interesting over the years. And while their sex lives in terms of frequency goes down, sex is actually more satisfying for adults, for older adults. They report it being more enjoyable, even though it doesn't happen as much. Okay, some more bads. Now, Also, I want to mention that I don't want to offend anyone here. Speculation, it is speculation. Statistics are statistics. If this sounds bad towards a certain person, your experience, your family's experience, anything, of course, it's not targeted to them. I don't know them. So with this being said, you can see that divorce rates are down since the 1980s. However, divorce rates for older couples is actually rising. And as we say in here, 1 in 8 women in the first marriage will get divorced. This is not that doesn't sound that high, but it is still pretty high. And 1 in 4 divorces were by people who were older than 50. So why does this happen? Well, some people say that society is becoming increasingly individualistic. I would be one of those people. So you spend less time together, and you also would maybe say if you've taken one for the team for a long time, you might want out so you can do what you want. Divorce is also more socially acceptable. A lot of people just kind of assume that half of half of marriages are going to end in divorce. But while it's becoming more acceptable, we can see that the rate is going down, so it's kind of an interesting trend. It also kind of went up when women started to work because women didn't feel kind of pressure as much, at least pressure to stay in a relationship just for financial reasons. But there's a lot of reasons that this occurs. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this before, but there are good effects for marriage and physical health. As we talked about in the romantic relationships PowerPoint, women tend to get more negative effects. Men get more positive effects once relationships begin. There's a positive effect more so for men than women, and the negative effect when relationships go downhill more for women than men. And this includes also physiological changes, not just psychological. And why is this the case? Well, some people say social integration. Basically, that women's social networks include friends and relatives. Prior to getting in a romantic relationship more so than men. Men tend to be kind of less socially integrated, at least kind of intimate relationship wise. Whereas when you get together, all of your effort goes to the other person. Not a whole lot of people who are married say that their spouse is not the person they are closest to. So there is a level of social support that occurs in a romantic relationship for men that oftentimes is not there prior, whereas women already kind of have more social support, which is why the good things go up more for men than women because they have the ability to do so. But also, the negative effects are bigger for women because once a relationship ends or goes downhill, oftentimes they've spent so much time and effort devoted to one relationship that they leave, or when the relationship is over or they leave, they are unable to have the social integration they had before, either because their friends are now married or unable to do it, or they've just kind of lost the closeness, the intimacy they once had in those relationships. We will need to also make a caveat here to say that the effect sizes on all of these are relatively small. Let's get to remarriage now. So divorce is a difficult thing for everyone, but it can be especially difficult for people who get divorced multiple times. 70 to 80% of people who are divorced eventually get remarried, but it's less the case for women. And this remarriage actually usually occurs within the first 2 years after they get divorced the first time. So, as I said in a slide or two ago, that people are getting divorced more when they get older. Remarriage is more difficult for middle-aged women. 90% of women under 25 remarried, whereas less than a third of women over age 40 remarry. And 75% of white women remarry, but less than half of black women remarry. So there's a lot of different variables in here. But one of the reasons that this occurs is that something called the marriage gradient. This pushes men to marry younger women. So if you look at the two people on the slide here, Helen Mirren and Harrison Ford, which one do you think is older? He is actually, well, at the time I wrote this, 71 and she's 68. They probably have had a birthday since then. Nonetheless, he's 3 years older than her. People tend to evaluate women's looks more harshly as they get older. The same age woman tends to look or be, at least be perceived by people as being older than the same aged man. And this is also reflective of just the general trends that societies are tend to be more harsh on women in terms of physical attractiveness, and so this seems to be one of the reasons that this occurs. Um, there are some good things with remarriage. They tend to be less romantic, but more realistic, meaning that people now seem to have a better idea of what they are getting themselves into, and so maybe they are more understanding of what a marriage is actually like. And there's also more shared duties, meaning that you are more likely to have an even or a more even distribution of work for men and women while they are in their second relationship or second marriage, excuse me. Unfortunately, though, second marriages aren't actually better off. They actually have a higher rate of divorce than first marriages. Why this occurs, lots of reasons speculated, but two of them. One is people might say you're less likely or you're less committed to a second relationship or second marriage because you've already left one, so you could walk away from the second one, especially if it starts to get bad. You know how bad it can be if you stay in there for a long time, and you just don't want to go through that again. But other people have talked about personality differences in terms of personality variables, that people who get divorced might be less agreeable or more aggressive, harsher, more difficult to get along with. And so they would, if you just randomly assign people to be with people who are less agreeable, that's less likely for it to stand. This is the primary thing why I wanted to caveat this by saying I'm not trying to insult anyone or anything, but there is research out there on that. In late adulthood, most people are pretty satisfied in their relationships when they get to late adulthood. However, it can be stressful. Money, aging, deteriorating health, all problems. Caring for spouses is particularly difficult. Not a whole lot of divorces happen in people over 60, only 2% in women over 60 in the last data I've seen. This happens partially because a husband might find someone younger, and there might be also more psychological difficulties after retirement. But it's hard to say because there are so few of these, relatively speaking. Retirement can also cause issues with household chores. Um, if a man was working and now comes home from retirement and just expects to relax and everything, might have taken for granted how much work goes into keeping up a house. So the wife might want them to participate more in work, but they might not want to do that. But meh. Um, and men at this point become reliant upon women a great deal more, typically because men are physiologically have more problems earlier than women. So you see up on the slide, 70% of women outlive their husbands, meaning that men are much more likely to be living with their spouse, but also they have more kind of chronic health conditions. Men smoke more and eat worse than women, and so they tend to be either living with their spouse or living in a retirement home or something like that. Not a whole lot of them outlive their wives. And also, men have particularly high rates of death following the death of their spouse.